Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest episode in our webinar series, Energy Transformed. It's a joint production between Ashurst and Renew Economy, and this is the third in the series. We started off a couple of months ago with a webinar focused on the market reforms. We moved on to net zero. What are we waiting for? And today's episode is new models in distributed generation and digitization of energy. So getting down into the details of this transformation towards net zero. And we've got an absolutely cracking cast here who will be moderated by Cassandra Wee from Ashurst, and I'll allow Cassandra to take over very, very soon. We're going to start off. Cassandra's going to be fielding a bunch of questions to our three guests, our three panelists, and then if you've got a question yourself, please put them in the Q&A. There's a chat forum, which is great for just people discussing things and expressing opinions and stuff like that. But if you do have a question, it would be helpful to us if you put it into Q&A, and we might sort of go into some of the audience questions around about half an hour into it, but certainly after about 50 minutes into it, and I'll be coming back to sort of co-host those along with Paul Curnow from Ashurst. So that should be good fun too. So please start thinking about your questions or react to anything that's being said. Once again, this is a series sponsored by Ashurst, and we're very grateful for them. It's a series of 4 webinars and 4 podcasts. I think the final episodes will probably happen in the new year now, but it's been great, and we're really very thankful for the huge audiences that we've received and the great feedback that we've received for these webinars, and it really has been fantastic. So I'd just like to thank our guests, our panelists for joining this webinar. I'd like to thank Ashurst once again and introduce you now to Cassandra, who will take it away. Cassandra.
Great, thanks Giles, and welcome everyone. I'm Cassandra Wee, a partner in our Energy and Projects group at Ashurst in Sydney. Before we kick off today, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we work in Australia. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to the youth who are working towards a brighter tomorrow. We're here today to talk about distributed energy resources, or DER, as we'll refer to it throughout our session. And in Australia, traditionally, we have a centralised energy system with big power plants in centralised locations generating most of the power we use. But this is changing. If we look to our future, a distributed energy system is under transformation. We've seen huge levels of activities in rooftop solar, home batteries, and the use of software for flexible generation. These can connect and create virtual power plants and can optimise time shifts of energy. We're also being led by what we call the prosumer choice, consumers being more proactive in energy. They want more control, visibility, and cost competition in their energy usage. And you can monitor all of this on an app on your phone or your smartwatch, perhaps. E-mobility is also popular, using electric vehicles and having EV chargers in public spaces, businesses, or at home. And there have been some great trials in the market using smart software to support charging at off-peak times. Within all of this, there's also smart metering, embedded networks, and the huge value in real-time energy data to foster different business models. Now, these examples I've just mentioned are just the tip of the iceberg of modern energy, and we'll explore more with our panel today. We have very gratefully Dr. Saul Griffith, a founder and chief scientist at Rewiring America, and he's also the founder of Rewiring Australia. Saul is a Sydney-born engineer and entrepreneur. He has a PhD from MIT, which is very impressive, and is a key advisor to the Biden administration. Dr. Gabrielle Cooper also joins us. She's a guest contributor to the Institute of Energy Economics and Financial Analysis, and she has over 20 years of experience. Gabrielle was also involved in developing the ESB's approach to integrating DER into the NEM, so we'll have a few questions about that today as well. Lucky last is Craig Rusak, CEO of Buildings Alive. He helps organisations achieve energy and environmental efficiency. Craig is passionate about active energy management for the built environment, and we're looking forward to hearing from him on live examples and business models in the industry. So let's start with a bang and have Saul first canvass why DER is a topic for us today. Saul, you've been busy advising the Biden administration on renewables with a huge focus on Electrifying Everything. So for our audience today, what do you mean by this, Saul, and why do you think it's important?
Electrify Everything is really to simplify the conversation. Maybe it's to sell books. Actually, I don't know if I can. So I just wrote a book last year that's doing well in the US called Electrify, which is like a realistic, detailed plan on how to achieve the decarbonisation we need to do on time. In Australia, as it is in the US, we are still having too many conversations about using carbon sequestration or biofuels or hydrogen or other distractions from what we already know is going to work and going to carry the heavy load of decarbonisation, which is electrification of our end users, and then generating that increased electricity with renewables and perhaps with nuclear. So really, Electrify Everything is a very simple statement to focus policy making, because there's a lot of loud voices and loud lobby groups that still are advantaged in slowing down this transition by selling us false gods. Natural gas as a transition fuel being one of the worst of the false gods. So understanding electrification is super important, and then that actually ends up being a conversation that can really engage the general public, because once we know that we have to electrify everything if we're to get to zero carbon, then you can look around your own life. And if you're a homeowner in Australia, actually roughly 40% of our domestic emissions are caused by decisions made around kitchen tables in homes. And by having the simple idea of electrification as the solution to that, we learn that the sort of 6-step plan is electrify your cars, put solar on your roof, electrify, hopefully with a heat pump, your water heat, electrify your space heat, electrify your kitchen, and then back it all up with a battery. And it starts to become a simple recipe that people can start to follow for decarbonisation, rather than, I think, allowing the delayers who would like to slow the transition by making it sound like, I think Australia has been stuck on moving quickly, waiting for a whole economy solution from the federal government, as opposed to let's do the things that we know work now immediately. And let's transition, let's talk about those things in terms of how they transform the domestic economy, the household, the small business. And it really is all about electrification at this point, which obviously then becomes a big conversation about DER, both in the distributed generation, because Australia has such spectacular distributed renewable assets. We're one of the lucky countries with probably the easiest path to nearly completely decarbonize at least the residential and the commercial sector on our own rooftops and in our own communities. And then that leads to, once you're doing the distributed generation, distributed batteries, and how we're going to do the demand response. And so I think, this is the decade to deliver, the decade for action, and Electrify Everything is to just try and make it a pretty simple recipe that we can all follow, because we got to go quick.
Sure. Thanks very much, Saul. Gabrielle, I want to bring you into this conversation as well. You've had multiple roles in energy with many years of experience. So fair to say you've got a great cross-section of the DER developments in Australia. In your view, why is DER so important, and why are so many companies and new models emerging in this area?
Thanks, Cass. There are 3 elements to distributed energy resources. So Saul's already talked about rooftop solar and it being the victory in the economic race to provide the lowest source of supply. That's distributed generation. We also have storage, and that's both batteries or batteries on wheels, more commonly known as electric vehicles. They're a couple of years away from being economic, but a vital part of our energy future. And most importantly, rooftop solar and electric vehicles combined are the perfect synergy between demand and storage and the potential for demand response. In terms of the third part of DER, that's flexible demand. And Australia's well short of realising our potential here, but it is huge. And we also forget that DER is not a new concept. We think of DER as rooftop solar and EVs and modern technology, But in fact, the first ripple control of hot water was brought in Australia in 1953. Now, that was brought in to soak up the abundant coal power that was available overnight, because as people probably know, it's very hard to ramp up or ramp down a coal-fired power station. So we had abundant coal power overnight. So we introduced ripple control of hot water for it to be heated overnight to soak up that coal power. Now we need to do the same sort of thing to soak up the abundant solar power in the middle of the day. What I'd say about business models is it very much depends on the policy settings. So we have a world-class PV industry in Australia with the lowest costs of installation because the government set a mission to support rooftop solar uptake. We don't have many business models at the moment for flexible demand that's aggregated from distributed energy resources because our wholesale demand response mechanism is only for large-scale commercial and industrial participants. We really get the changes we need and the innovative business models when governments have a vision to support decarbonisation. It's not the other way around. Sometimes businesses can lead, but we really need governments to set that direction.
Great. Thanks, Gabrielle. And Craig, let's share some of your industry knowledge in this area as well and drill down perhaps to some examples in the built environment. What drives DR from an industry perspective, and can you unpack for us what you see or call as active energy management in infrastructure?
Well, thanks. Yeah, look, I'd pick up straight away from what Gabrielle mentioned, the third critical element of DER being flexibility. And frankly, the fact that consumers of electricity don't exercise, they don't flex that flexibility in a sense. Electricity, buildings, if you include residential and commercial buildings, account for something like 70% of our electricity consumption. And the non-residential, probably half of that. And they're completely detached from the reality of the generation variability that happens when you introduce more and more non-dispatchable resources, which of course we need to do. We need more renewable energy, more solar, more wind, but you also need a market for that. You need something to take it up. And Gabrielle mentions batteries on wheels. Well, buildings absolutely can be part of that as well. Buildings have capacity to create more demand at certain times by providing more services to occupants, driving better indoor air quality and so forth, and also back off at times as well. And we just don't seem to touch on that. So there's a huge opportunity, I think, there, and it's actually absolutely crucial that the demand side be an active participant with all these developments happening on the supply side. We need a two-sided market where you've got active participants. And that, obviously, my focus is buildings because I think that's a crucial component, just underutilised.
And just staying with you, Craig, for a little bit longer, we also spoke recently about some very interesting examples about customers effectively having cheaper electricity if they're on full wholesale pricing. I found this to be quite interesting and just wondered if you could take us through your findings.
Yeah, for sure. Look, Gabrielle mentioned this ripple control of hot water. In fact, you'd go back to the 1880s when the tariff structures that we currently have were invented in the UK to essentially drive demand at night with off-peak electricity rates. So essentially most of us pay off-peak, shoulder peak rates for our electricity, which bear no relationship to the wholesale electricity market, which varies by the minute. And as the energy supply from solar and wind is added to the market price goes down just as the carbon intensity of the electricity supply goes down. So we've been looking at this. Very rare to find any consumers of electricity, unless they're really large and really sophisticated, to find them in any way connected to the reality of the wholesale market. But if you were to, you would find that typically, say a building in South Australia, say an office building in South Australia, if it was paying the rates, just say a margin on top of a wholesale rate, so the spot price, with all the distribution, transmission, infrastructure charges and the like, they'd be saving something like 40% off their electricity bill by doing nothing different. And that's not even tapping into the flexibility that I just described. So that's an enormous opportunity, but it's only really emerged in the last couple of years, I think, with the rapid growth of non-dispatchable electricity supplies. It wasn't the case a few years ago when you had a small slither of solar or wind topping up what was mostly dispatchable, conventional centralized generation. So I'd like to think people will, shall I say, just start waking up to this enormous opportunity that the market's presenting, and it won't be long, hopefully, until we start seeing demand then responding to price. But you're talking a bit less in New South Wales and Queensland and Victoria, but they're not far behind. I think you're on mute.
Great. Thanks, Craig. That's exactly what we're here for. So that's terrific to talk through some of those examples. Now, because I'm a lawyer, you all knew I was going to ask a question about policy today as well. So we know that Australia has been accelerating its renewable investment and generation, particularly in the last few years, but there's still concerns around whether the policy is properly supporting this growth. And we've already heard from both Saul and Gabrielle some concerns around government's speed or lack of speed perhaps, and policy developments as well. So on this topic, let's start with Saul. What do you think are the key policy changes that need to happen here in Australia? And what are the challenges that you see would get in the way of good policy?
So I think you've got to be careful about which are federal policies, what federal policies can do, what state policies can do, and what local city ordinance building codes and policies can do. In reality, for most nations, federal policy is limited to pushing money around, but not actually influencing some of the things you need to happen on the ground. So let's talk about that. One thing Australia did spectacularly was the certification and training program for solar installers, which eliminated the soft costs of solar. That's why Australia enjoys the cheapest installed solar cost in the developed world at under $1 a watt. In the US, for comparison, it's 3 times that, and solar in the US is only on 2% of homes because it's more expensive than the grid, which is not the experience in Australia, where it's 30% of homes and 50% in some places, and it's much, much cheaper than the grid. We need to think about that experience for the other pieces of this Electrify Everything recipe. So what do we need to do to make batteries extremely cheap? Now, today, batteries are installing at $1,200, $1,300 per kilowatt hour on the side of the house. That's absurd, given that the battery cells themselves are $100 or $150 a kilowatt hour. So we have the same sort of soft cost problem, early market problem with batteries now that we had with solar 5 years ago. So we should think about certification and training programs for battery installations that eliminates a lot of those soft costs, bulk buying, etc. That would be hugely important. We should think about the same type of thing again for installing vehicle charging. There's 20 odd million vehicles in Australia. First level of approximation, that means we need 20 million electric vehicle charging points. We should try to make sure that we eliminate regulatory costs and soft costs so that that's as cheap as possible. And then we need to continue further to train HVAC technicians and electricians so that we have enough people to do the HVAC and electrical upgrades to houses to get this job done in the next 2 decades. So any regulation that can help any of those is really important. To tie it all together, if I had one wish list in Australia, it's to unshackle AEMO and the distribution networks from running more experiments. We are running one experiment like every 2 years at some small scale, and that's just not going to be fast enough to figure out what the right thing is in terms of real-time pricing for everyone or tiered pricing, et cetera, et cetera. So we need, and this has been suggested before, many more sandboxes and many more experiments to figure out what really is going to enable the most demand response, what's going to enable the most distributed generation, because it is that distributed generation that's going to be the cheapest energy, and it's going to be demand response that makes it all possible. And we're just not on track right now to really fully exploit that. We're probably going to need to deliver 2 to 3 times more electricity to every home and small business. So that load growth is going to be huge. That's going to mean enormous upgrades and changes to how the distribution grids operate. I don't think we're really greasing the skids there well enough in Australia. I think we need to ask ourselves hard questions of where should the storage be. Yes, we've talked about batteries on wheels. They're great. Thermal systems in homes are great batteries also. But if we have all of the batteries on the house or building side of the distribution grid, we're going to run into voltage and phase control issues. If we have all of the batteries on the transmission side, it's going to be the same. I think we should be asking ourselves questions about, are there other places for these storage batteries to be, and what are the regulations and policies to get to? And I mean, like community batteries are a great idea for supporting this. Perhaps batteries in appliances to eliminate soft costs. We should be taking a bigger look at that. So there's a smorgasbord of recommendations for you.
Thanks very much. Gabrielle, I wondered if you to some extent share or have different views with Saul. You've got a very impressive track record advising the Energy Security Board, and we know that the ESB has been looking for opportunities for DER. So just wondering if you've got any comments on what Saul's mentioned and any other views from the proposed DER implementation plan, whether in fact this reform pathway will lead to a successful integration of DER by 2025.
Thanks. I might start with the highly technical, picking up on Saul's point about pilots and also about the importance of both managing the grid and the system as a whole, and then work my way up to the meta policy level. Australia has been very slow. I think we've lacked the foresight about how quickly solar was going to change the system. But one of the fantastic innovations that has come through and is currently being piloted in South Australia, but will be rolled out across South Australia from the middle of 2022, is this idea of dynamic operating envelopes. So for people who are not familiar, at the moment, if you install a solar system, you usually have a fixed export limit, say 5 kilowatts for a household. But that doesn't take into account how much capacity is available on your local distribution network at that point in time. So what's been developed in South Australia and is going to be trialled throughout the country is this idea that your exports and imports can change on a 1 or 5 minute basis, and that's forecast 24 hours ahead. So what those flexible exports enable you to do is maximize the use of any DER behind the meter and how that can be exported, or it can also be used to control for imports. As Saul said, there are times where we will need to take into account how much EV charging is happening and the impacts of that on the grid. So dynamic operating envelopes are an Australian innovation. They're not being done anywhere else in the world, and they need to be speeded up as fast as possible. There are no silver bullets in this space, but they are an absolutely fantastic innovation, and be really good to see them, and also the governance of DER technical standards, put in new arrangements for that, put in place as soon as possible. Going up to the meta level, I think the challenge, particularly through the Energy Security Board and its whole post-2025 work program, has been, and this is true of the energy market institutions, a lot of the major energy players and parts of government, has been status quo bias. Now, this is understandable. Everyone has been trained to deal with large generation. We're now dealing with large solar and wind farms and transmission instead of coal and gas. But that means we've underestimated the potential for DER, and we haven't given it the policy and regulatory attention we need. A lot of listeners probably would have heard there was another world record in Australia on the weekend, on Sunday, where 96% of demand in South Australia was met by rooftop solar alone. So there is phenomenal capacity, without even talking about things Craig was mentioning in terms of flexible demand and the like. So we really need to see a lot more resources, a lot more focus, both at the policy and regulatory levels into DER integration. And I don't think we have that at the ESB or elsewhere at the moment.
Wonderful. Thanks, Gabrielle. It looks like we've got a few burning questions from our audience. So keen to open fire, I think, to some of these questions that have come in. Paul, Giles, would you like to coordinate those?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Cass. Yeah, a few questions coming in, I guess, particularly on some of the policy design options. But before we go to that, Craig, just one here, picking up on your point about the 40% saving. Question was whether that also included turning off some loads and whether that was automated or manual. So was this just assuming nothing else changed as far as what people did, and it was just that exposure?
It's assuming nothing changes. And what we've established with buildings, typical commercial building, you can shift 20% of the load in the typical building for something like 4 hours without having any detrimental impact on occupants. In fact, you can have an enhancement. And so that's literally just without doing anything. I think it's yeah, that's the answer. It's bigger than that.
Yeah, okay. So it sounds, yeah, I guess it's one of these sort of, we've always had low-hanging fruit, haven't we, in terms of some of these things which are not sort of requiring major technology changes, particularly in energy efficiency. So that's
quite right. Yeah, quite right. Yep.
So just a couple other questions here, Cass, just picking up on this, on the storage, and I guess some of the sort of incentives. And I think, Saul, you might have picked up on this already in a written response, but I guess there's a few questions here about how much can we tie behavior and how people use storage system, whether that's in an EV form or otherwise, to benefit. So a question here around, does it make sense for governments to provide rebates depending on owners making the batteries available for certain use as a VPP, or mandate, or I guess also requiring that those electric vehicles, for example, have to be capable of supporting the grid, for example, during evening peak. So maybe to Saul and Gabrielle, if you've got any thoughts on those sorts of rebates tied to people actually, behaving in a certain way as well.
I think we need every possible form of incentive, and we don't know what the right ones are yet. I think rebates are very smart because they are a progressive form. It means it's affordable to everyone. The US prefers tax cuts, which is only affordable to the top end of town. So the wealthiest half of homes can cash in on a tax deduction. I think we should, as governments are making these investments, they need to very strongly consider what they're going to ask for in exchange. So, if you are rebating electric vehicles $5,000 or $10,000 each, will the government demand some portion of that battery in response, or do you use a market mechanism? I mean, I have a data set that's about 10 years worth of tens of thousands of EVs. The problem with electric vehicles is people treat them like their cell phones. They park them on their bedside table at night and they charge them overnight. That is not going to be when the majority of electricity is made in the future. So you need to think about those behavioral aspects. And so, workplace charging, community charging looks like a great idea because that could be happening during the day. And we're going to need to incentivize matching the vehicle charging to solar production in every possible way. And I don't see enough of incentives designed to do that. For example, the interesting number is the following, when the electric SUVs or trucks start to come. So we're starting to see them in the US. I've seen Ford F-150s and Rivians in the wild here in the US. They have 100, 120 kilowatt hour batteries. That effectively is days of storage for an individual house. The average Australian house has 1.7 cars. So, there'll be 10 days worth of storage In the vehicles, that storage is very cheap. If you buy an electric F-150, it's $40,000. The cost of the battery is effectively, it's a $400 per kilowatt hour battery with a free truck, which is 1/3 of the cost of the batteries that are being installed in Australia right now, which are $1,200 or $1,300 a kilowatt hour and go on. They look like a fire hazard on the side of your house. Very different things. So we got to think about incentivizing getting those costs lower. The reality of a $1,200 or $1,300 kilowatt hour battery is it's not yet economic, and it never will be. We need to hit targets of $200 to $400 a kilowatt hour. And actually, the secret is in the statement I just made. Cars are not regulated by building codes or fire codes. That's why that battery is a few $100s a kilowatt hour. It's installed in the factory, whereas a battery installed on their house is a custom home edition that's all sorts of building and regulatory codes. So we've got to eliminate all of those soft cost frictions, because until the per kilowatt hour cycle cost of batteries is under 10 cents, they're just not going to really make enough difference. That will happen when we get that sort of $400 a kilowatt hour in a car price tag.
Gabriel, just bring you in here as well. What do you, I mean, I guess I know in the DR package there were a whole bunch of regulatory reforms and rule changes, obviously important here. But in terms of sort of, you know, direct consumer incentives or influencing behaviour, what are your thoughts around some of that?
Yeah, look, I agree with everything that Saul said, and the economics of this are really complicated. Because the highest and best value use, obviously, of rooftop solar is to put it into a battery on site and then feed it back into the network. That obviously means you avoid all of the other normal costs, particularly network costs and retail costs. But as Saul also pointed out, the capacity of electric vehicle batteries are going to be particularly for households such that you could never use all of that electricity even overnight, over 2 or 3 nights. So what we want to do is make sure that we're making the best use of those batteries that consumers have paid their own money for and treat them like a grid resource. So there's going to need to be regulatory changes. We're going to need to have those smart charging standards to ensure managed charging, two-way charging, and when it becomes economic, vehicle to grid. And we're going to need the financial incentives. You know, New South Wales is now offering about $5,000 for an electric vehicle, but that's relatively small compared to the average cost and the like. The other thing that I think is going to be increasingly crucial in all of this is how we set our network revenue. So we've had basically the model adopted from the UK of OPEX, CAPEX and rate of return. And we're not really, no one is taking seriously the fact that the nature of a network business has fundamentally changed. So you're going from one-way flows to multi-way flows. The business of being an electricity distribution company, your local poles and wires, is getting a lot more complicated. And in that complexity, what we need to focus on is the services that DNSP, that distribution company, is delivering to consumers. So I think we need to be looking really seriously at performance-based regulation, at taking into account qualitative as well as quantitative measures of performance. And in doing so, we need to rethink not only the overall revenue regulation, but also the tariff structures. Because if we keep having as high network tariffs as we have had, then that's going to be a major disincentive for people exporting back into the grid. So that's a very big picture, long-term reform that no one's been courageous enough to take on yet. But I think that's absolutely vital in making sure that we optimise the use of DR for the benefit of all electricity system users.
Great, thanks. Well, Cass, I'll throw back to you now, and we'll come back to some other questions in a bit.
Right. Thanks, Paul. So I think we've explored some of the policy questions and potential issues in some detail now. I wondered perhaps if we can examine some of the other issues in DR and also opportunities. So Craig, you've often said in the press that, our infrastructure problems as a country are fast becoming software problems in the energy context. So what are the challenges that you see within electricity infrastructure in Australia? And can you perhaps expand on this a bit more?
Well, so when I say software problem, I think the first component is information. There's a real information gap. People that use electricity, but I'm talking business, any consumer of electricity is not really aware of the carbon intensity or carbon footprint of that unit of electricity they're using, which changes in real time. So if that can be addressed in terms of information, if we can have access to, and this is one of the things that we work on a lot in our R&D at Buildings Alive, trying to understand in real time what the emissions intensity of a unit of electricity is and be able to forecast that and forecast it accurately, then you can start using distributed resources to respond and provide a positive contribution, essentially. So as Sol said, plug your phone in at night or whatever. It's a coal powered phone, right? If you plug your car in at night and there's no, renewable, very little. Sorry, Sol.
No, I want to say something contrarian here. Everyone's betting on all this information being fabulous. I have all this information. I've looked at real-time disaggregated by appliance loads for 36,000 homes for full years, all the seasonal cycles and everything. And actually, we all look pretty much the same. Most people get up somewhere between 5 and 8 a.m. and most people go to bed sometime between 9 and midnight. And our loads are pretty similar. And if you really think about the structure of the distribution grid and the transmission grid, and I think this is critical, like we have distribution transformers, each one serves roughly 50 houses. So the law of averaging of the natural grid is averaging the loads in 50 homes. And it really smooths out all of these things. And like everyone's like, oh, we need blockchain, we need huge amounts of data. I'm like, no, you roughly need to know when the sun is up, and it's going to be pretty predictable for the next, I don't know, 3 billion years. And we need to roughly align car charging, heating water, heating spaces with that. And we need to store enough for the loads that you're going to do overnight, which is playing your Nintendo and using the induction cooktop. I think we're over, like, actually the problem here is fucking hardware. Can we all just admit that we need to finance the build out? The software is damn easy and it is not going to require AI or machine learning or anything fancy. Like, let's just roll up our sleeves, roll out the hardware and do this.
But and I won't disagree with any of that. I'll just continue and just say, look, the thing is, you won't find a building management system in any complex, commercial institutional building, which takes into account any of that information currently. And so really what we're talking about is connecting the information to the machines. So building management system makes a decision. Let's say right now in Sydney, it's getting a bit warm, a bit humid. It's decided to trim back. It's shut down the outside air intake. It's turned the dampers right down. It's minimizing its energy use as much as possible. And yet, right at this moment, the solar generation is maximized as well. So buildings are working actively against. And so the point, I guess, is to close that gap. Software informs hardware, right? And hardware, it's unrealistic to expect facilities managers, people like that, tradespeople responsible for the operation of these facilities to go and manually do all this stuff. So that's what I think your proposition is quite right, Cass. We are moving from a more mechanical approach to a more information-based approach, and that will inform, more responsive demand. And that, by the way, the example we just heard, South Australia, fantastic result in the last few days with its generation pretty much entirely met from solar. The price on the wholesale market's negative, and demand wasn't soaking it up. No building owner drove their plan harder, but they could have. And I think it's a huge opportunity. definitely.
Wonderful. Thanks, Craig. Just picking up on, I suppose, some of the comments earlier around technical standards for DER, be it hardware or software. I think we're finding it a little bit less coordinated than our other jurisdictions like Germany and California, who have governance in place for technical standards. So Gabrielle, I wondered what your thoughts are on the new DER technical standards that have been introduced by the AMC earlier this year. Do you think that they help with the integration and providing secure and reliable supply to consumers?
Thanks, Cass. To start with the last point first, the question is, why is this important? Before listeners go to sleep when I start talking about technical standards. It goes, for example, Craig talked about the challenges of the belly of the duck curve getting lower and lower. And my metaphor for the day is that we need a camel to come along with a hump to fill in the belly of the duck curve. And to do that, we're going to need standards around managed charging of batteries or electric vehicles, vehicle to grid. And we need those standards to be in the national electricity rules. And until the new standard that was put in, which for those people who don't know was AS 4777.2 for inverters, which supports solar systems and batteries to ride through disturbances to the grid, we didn't have a single DER technical standard in the national electricity rules, which tells you something about how far behind regulation has been. When I was with the Energy Security Board, the number one thing that stakeholders wanted to see resolved was to have new governance arrangements for DER technical standards, to make sure that there was a body that could set a vision and a work program about these were the priority appliances or systems, hardware or software that needed to have standards embedded in the rules, and set that out and take that forward. Fortunately, the AMC has now kicked off the ESB's rule change proposal on that. And I encourage anyone listening to get involved, put in a submission and try and help ensure that that gets put in place as soon as possible. This is a much belated reform and it's desperately needed. As I said, we can have all of the financial incentives, but unless we get the technical standards right, and also sometimes the technical standards are a much cheaper way of bringing about the changes we need than the financial incentives. We can just put voltage disturbance ride through in a technical standard without paying for that service, for example.
I disagree with the idea that California or Europe or anyone else is ahead. It's just not true. I'm calling in from California in a completely all-electric home that I built last year, and I had to fight against the city and the state at every point to make it an electric zero carbon home. I have to do all of my demand response behind the meter because you can't negotiate with PG&E. Australia is leading the world, has the opportunity to lead it by a giant margin. And the reason that that is true is because of 30% of penetration of rooftop solar versus 1 or 2%. Australia is seeing I won't call them problems, or you could, but is seeing these opportunities 3 to 5 years before the rest of the world. That's actually something we should be focusing on and capitalizing on. I would be cautious about us looking abroad for getting the regulations perfect, as opposed to running multiple experiments faster in Australia to converge on the right solution. Because the reality is that we don't have an all electric suburb anywhere in the world yet that's balancing everything below a substation, which is probably around 1,000 or 1,500 homes. Australia will probably have that suburb first. If we do, and we're solving the problems to balance that distribution grid's problems, then we have the opportunity to sell that technology and write that draft regulation and policy for the rest of the world to follow.
So you've just answered my next question to you, which was whether we do as a country have the opportunity to lead rather than just adopt positions globally. And it sounds like you're saying that there is an opportunity to lead, a shift to a greener future in Australia, subject to, some policy challenges and speed that we've discussed before. I wondered also, in your experience in the US, are the policy challenges that we are facing in Australia very similar or different? Is there anything that we can draw from that would improve the area here?
America is suffering hugely from a hangover of Reaganism, where they gutted the civil service and don't really believe in technocracy anymore. And because of the division between the federal government and the right for individual states to do whatever the hell they want, it's swinging all over the needle here. I think actually in Australia, we haven't quite yet gutted the technocracy and the highly trained and engaged civil servants that are trying to get the regulations right and build these systems out correctly. We have largely state governments still owning the distribution network. So there's a chance, therefore, that we actually can do this faster and better because there's fewer layers of governance and there's fewer hands on the tiller. And I actually see a lot of thoughtful engagement. I see a lot of requests for information and opportunities to engage and influence the regulations in Australia that doesn't really happen in the same way in the US. It happens a little bit in California and New York that way through the CEC and NYSERDA, but they're the closest in the US, but they're still behind, I think, where the conversation is in Australia. I think the state, honestly, you could point to a set of state regulations. If you could pick and choose what Western Australia is doing best, what Tasmania is doing best, what ACT and New South Wales and Victoria are doing best, and you could put it all together, we're getting close. It's just not all in one place yet.
It's a bit of a patchwork still, by state by state. Fair. So Giles, I think you've got a couple of questions from the audience to chip in here as we talk about more of the international lens of issues.
I just actually wanted to chime in with a couple of things. One saw there's actually in the ACT, they're actually building some electric suburbs now. So some of the new developments there, they're not being connected to the gas network. So that's a bit of a start, and and people on existing houses actually given permission to cut themselves off from the gas distribution network, which has been a hard thing to do in some other places. I'm kind of interested actually with another question for Gabrielle and Craig, but vehicle to load, I actually got to drive a Ioniq 5 electric vehicle last week, and it was the first one in Australia with vehicle to load. And so we were filming a video and we went to Centennial Park and we just sat down and boiled a kettle from the car, which was pretty exciting. You talked about the F-150 with their massive batteries and things like that. I mean, how hard is it going to be with the vehicle to grid? Because we've been running pilots on these things here for a couple of years, and as Gabrielle mentioned, there's still no standards there. It just seems to me that it's almost going to be a vehicle to load type thing unless we actually get quickly moving to incorporate these things with a vehicle to grid. And I'm not really too sure what the issue is there. And maybe you've got a point of view, and maybe Gabrielle or Craig have got a perspective as well.
I mean, nothing's hard here, and there's a whole lot of people who, there are workarounds published all over the internet of how to do V2G with your Tesla, or, I do it with my Nissan 2014 Nissan Leaf, and I'm doing it it is not technically difficult. It is basically, this is an IP fight between the automakers, because some of them got IP on V2G and some of them didn't. It's the grid operators not really knowing how to play. To put that in perspective, the F-150 is the most produced vehicle of all time. 50 million have been produced, about 20 million still on the roads in the US. If you electrified overnight all of the F-150s, Ford Motor Company, through that one vehicle model, would be the largest utility company in the US. That is how giant the load and the amount of electricity that goes through that. At that point, is Ford a competitor with your distribution grid or with your utility energy suppliers? And I actually think it's like those corporate questions that are handicapping this V2G. No one knows who the threat is. It's not technically hard.
Craig, I'd just like to throw a question to you. It's about sort of the batteries, and we're talking about the rebates. We talked about that South Australia was quite remarkable. It wasn't just rooftop solar doing 95% of the state demand in that state. We actually had negative demand for a few periods. So the question is, do you have any sort of immediate solutions to that, apart from sort of the idea of more storage? But there's also been this idea, we've got so much rooftop now, there's been suggestions recently between maybe adapting the rebates that now sort of encourage more rooftop solar, and maybe them adapting them to sort of encourage more battery, more battery storage. Do you agree with that? Because it does go to these questions, and there's quite a few sort of questions here from the audience about, how do we get more batteries into the homes?
It seems that when we're talking about batteries, we're talking about a particular type of battery, but really I think you could broaden it and talk about storage generally. So pumped hydro, for example, but buildings, as it sometimes it doesn't occur to people when we talk about in buildings, the thermal capacity, but indoor air quality is capacity thing as well. It's the service they provide. Can you do that at a different time? Can you stop something? Can you start something? And that's really the crux of it, because those batteries, just some back of the envelope calculations. If you look at what the IEA is saying we need in terms of battery storage, 10,000 gigawatt hours of batteries in the next decade. Well, just harnessing that load shift capacity is effectively about 20% of that, and it's sitting there right now. We're only at a small fraction of what is projected to be required currently. So the question is, doesn't need to be an either or. I mean, that's a massive task, and you won't get it just with one type of battery technology or one particular solution. That's the whole concept of DER versus historically, we build another power station. We need to harness all of this capacity, and flexibility in the network is this massive capacity in existing infrastructure, and it has no environmental impact in its manufacture. It doesn't degrade with use. It doesn't have a disposal cost, and it actually doesn't even have a capital cost. So that's why I always start with that, because the rate of return on your existing asset by using it smarter is infinite.
Gabrielle, do you have anything to say on this?
To pick up that point about its batteries, but also flexible demand. People might not know, we have no national requirement for any household appliances to have demand response capability. So there have been lots of pilots and lots of trials, and Queensland has an approach through Energy Queensland to do control of hot water and of air conditioning systems. But if we were to put demand response capability, and that smart capability where you can provide revenue grade demand response into the GEMS Act, that's the Greenhouse and Energy Minimum Standards Act, and that would be something the Commonwealth could do easily, then that would help immensely in tapping into the fleet of household appliances that are out there to help create this camel to fill the belly of the duck curve. I want to also, though, to expand upon the point about what a battery fleet gives you in the future of retail. So Tesla have taken out a retail license in the UK. There's a Californian company called Ohm Connect, and point of disagreement with Saul, they are a major participant in the Californian wholesale demand response market, because they've got 200,000 households.
I'm not sure what point I said. I mean, Ohm Connect's great, but you still, if you are in certain locations, can't even work with them because of the rules.
So Ohm Connect are now working with Origin, and the point I'm trying to make here is that it's going to be companies that can tap into household fleets of solar panels, electric vehicles, battery storage, and smart demand responsive appliances that are going to be the future. Those large gentailers that have relied on their fleets of coal and gas-fired power stations, they are simply not going to be able to compete. And I think we'll see them dying slowly or quickly if you're looking at AGL's share price lately. And then that's no bad thing. And that this shows how the energy market is transforming. It's becoming distributed, it's becoming digital, and it's going to create a huge amount of value if we can flex demand into the future.
And looking to the future, Gabrielle, what excites you most about, the different types of hardware and software? I know we've spoken a lot about a whole spectrum of different types of DER, but in your mind, what are the top 2 or top 3 ones that you think have the most uptake in Australia?
On hardware, I'm very excited about integrated PV. So integrating solar panels into vehicles, into buildings, and the fact that there's still a huge amount of innovation in this space. And I think we'll be using the power of the sun to fuel so much of what we do into the future. In terms of software and business models, I think it's those companies that are trying to build the smarts into distributed fleets. So there's a company in Australia called Bright, and they are financing rooftop solar plus storage and electric vehicles. And I think companies that are thinking differently about what it is that customers want, i.e. reliable and cheap supply that doesn't necessarily, that takes into account all of the investments that people are wanting to make in rooftop solar and the like. I think that's the future.
Great. And just picking up, I suppose, on the financing aspects, Saul, are you seeing any trends or new types of financial products that are out there to help fund household programs and really drive forward this push?
Macquarie Bank and Commonwealth Bank are probably, leading the world, shockingly enough. Only 6 months ago, Macquarie Bank announced essentially a finance product for electric vehicles and other financing products against the home loan for heating and cooling systems and batteries and solar. And so I think the prototypes are advancing pretty well in Australia, and that's because the economics are actually working. In the US, it's lagging because the economics just aren't as strong. Although there's some interesting things. So there are regional utilities in the US that will front the upfront cost of your appliances and allow you to buy that back against the bill and then own the appliance at the end of that. They are actually underwritten by the Department of Energy in the US, which gives them incredibly low cost of finance. I think models like that are critical if we're going to go to the lower income homes effectively, where it's upfront cost and access to credit that's the problem. So I think for homeowners with good credit scores that have access to financing against their mortgage, Australia is doing a great job also now for the vehicles. But at the low end of the market, nowhere in the world has really figured out how to make this affordable to renters, how to make this affordable to low income homes, because it's the access to the credit for the high upfront cost that's a real challenge.
And staying on the theme of the future, I think, Craig, we've discussed a lot about green buildings, net zero buildings. Potentially, could this lead to carbon positive buildings in the future? And what types of developments are you really excited about in expanding opportunities in this space?
Well, I'm frankly more excited about buildings being active participants in an integrated energy system than I am in individual buildings being able to label themselves carbon neutral, even carbon positive, because probably the bigger contribution is, as Gabrielle's been saying, is to drive that demand to support further investment in our renewable energy infrastructure. When we've got a wholesale market that doesn't actually pay for solar electricity most of the time, we've got a problem. So we obviously need demand. So I think it's the role of buildings, the built environment, which, as I say, is 70% or thereabouts of the consumption on the market. If that can be an active player and considered part of the energy system, just as we can think of cars as part of the energy system as well. We've never thought of cars as the energy system. We thought of it as a transportation system, but these systems come together. So rather than treating a building as an island, if you like, thinking of it as an integrated part, I think we'll move really, really fast.
Great. I think we've got a couple of questions from the audience, I believe. Giles, if you wanted to coordinate those as well, to add them in.
Okay. Paul, have you actually caught anything to your eye? I'm just been caught short here.
Well, yeah, there was a question, I guess, coming back, there was a question right at the beginning, and I think, Saul, you made a comment around this, which was really around, I guess, that transition, gas, I guess the whole question around gas is transition. And I know you sort of debunked that as a false god right up front. But there's a question here around, I guess, if we think about the time we've got to also decarbonize the grid. So when you electrify everything, I guess, to Craig's point about the intensity, the carbon intensity within the grid, is there still a role for gas in there? I mean, we're still only at what, 27% renewables, maybe it's 29% now.
I think everyone's got to, I understand your question. I think everyone's got to understand that load growth is going to outpace your retirement problems of existing fossil fuels. So, and any electric asset that you're purchasing now is going to appreciate in its carbon value, in the sense that the grid is not going to get more carbon intense. It's only going to get better and better and better. So anytime you electrify anything, it's only a better and better carbon answer in the future. So that load growth of 2x means, I worry a little bit less about a few remaining natural gas plants on the grid. And you can see there's good modeling done in the US by Hal, I can't remember his last name, but keeping 1 or 2 gas peaker plants to deal with seasonal peak loads is maybe the lowest carbon way to get to like 95% decarbonization. So that's not gas-led recovery. That's like, removing the last least bad asset to do the transition elegantly. So, I think there's that. I think the real problem that's underappreciated is getting people off residential and commercial gas in appliances in their homes. That's not as less of a problem in Queensland, much more of a problem in Victoria. Enormous problem in the US. That's because that's millions of machines and millions of purchasing decisions. And, we don't even publicly publish the network data for the gas networks, and people still have the right, if you have one person in a 1,000-person community connected to the same gas distribution lines that says we want to keep gas, the utilities are obliged to leave that in place, making that gas for that one house very expensive and screwing the cost. So I actually think we need to start getting into the weeds of transition of like, okay, how do you actually cut the gas spigot, not off one home, but off the whole suburb? That's, the ACT test suburbs for all electric, that's greenfield new build stuff. That's a lot easier, but we have to remember, by 2050, greenfield new builds only going to be 15-20% of our building stock. So we have to figure out how to elegantly retrofit, how to elegantly pull everyone off gas on the residential.
Which is what is happening in the Netherlands, where they have a concept of gas exit. I don't know if they borrowed from Brexit, but they are looking at how they take suburb by suburb, city by city off the gas network. And that's obviously in a climate where the vast majority of heating is from gas. So if the Netherlands can take on that challenge, obviously there's a geopolitical dimension for the Netherlands, being no one in Western Europe wants to be reliant on Russian gas.
Although, Lily D'Ambrosio, to give her a shout out, she's already saying the same things about Victoria. Yeah. How do we do this for Victoria?
That was what I was about to say. So it's great that, particularly Victoria is taking on this challenge because it is the state where that's the most difficult. However, it's also a major issue in South Australia, and we've yet to see the South Australian government take the same proactive approach to looking at a gas transition there. And across the country, we've actually got 5 million homes that rely on gas. So I wanted to emphasise this is no small task. Agree with Saul, it needs to happen as quickly as possible. It's going to take a lot more momentum than we've currently got. But of course, the job creation potential that goes with that is enormous.
What about, just one more question here, and I'll hand back to Giles if there's any extra, but a few questions here around hydrogen fuel cells, I guess. Then how do you see hydrogen fitting in? I mean, I guess from that, it's really as a source of producing green electricity, and I guess the ability to have storage, long-term storage as part of that, even seasonal perhaps.
So let's be honest, hydrogen as seasonal storage is a terrifying idea because the tanks are enormously expensive. I know that because I sold tank technology to all the world's automotives and know what it costs. So for seasonal storage, it's a rough proposition. For pretty much everything, it's a rough proposition. The reality is that hydrogen is going to be generated from green electricity, but it's going to increase the cost of that energy 3 or 4 or 5x, because fundamentally, if you take electricity, turn it into hydrogen, and then get it back into an end use like heating or driving a car, you need 3 or 4 times as much of your renewable electricity in the first place. So like by definition, it's going to be 3, 4, 5 times more expensive. So I think we have a hugely overinflated hydrogen conversation in Australia that's very, very dangerous. The IEA, which don't think of it as an independent international energy organization, it was a group of nations who had interests in supplying fossil fuels to the world. That's where the International Energy Agency comes from. Unfortunately, they said 50% of the world's electricity is going to be making hydrogen by 2050. That's a terrible idea, but a huge number of governments listened to that, and including Australia, because Australia wants to be the supplier to the customers who want it, like Germany and Japan, for historical national interest reasons. But this is all clouding the conversation. Hydrogen is going to be a small part of the system. It'll be very good for things like ammonia, maybe in a few unique industrial applications, maybe in some freight, but even freight looks like it's going to be won by batteries. I think we need to kill this hydrogen hype as soon as possible so we can focus on the real task. It's a dangerous distraction and a very, very expensive distraction in Australia.
I'll hand back to Giles. Have you any other questions? I think we might also be coming up to time, but hand back to Giles and then to Cass.
Yeah, just a quick one, actually, just on that electrification. And look, there's another one for you, Saul, actually. There was one question here. It's curious as to why Biden is apparently preferencing General Motors over Tesla. There was this infamous thing last week where Biden was appearing, well, he was appearing at a General Motors function, but he managed to sort of credit them with the electrification of the car industry and snub Tesla. I'm just wondering if you can just sort of comment about that. Maybe you weren't aware of that, but also just maybe just sort of, because you're in California, just sort of give us a bit of a taste of the differences in the political sort of developments in the US and in Australia, because I guess we're pretty frustrated with what we see with the policy and political development in Australia, but then kind of we look at the US and we go, maybe it's not so bad.
So looking at there's 4 or 5 questions there, but just someone to let the market decide on hydrogen in the comments. The problem is Australian government is trying to subsidize the hydrogen market, so it's exactly not letting the market decide. The market has decided, and it's not hydrogen, and that's so I think this is the problem. On your question about Biden and GM, let's be honest, GM beat Tesla by 20 years, made the EV1, made significant investments, made a highly aerodynamic, very, very good electric vehicle. So I think he was nodding to that, not actually trying to criticize Tesla. Tesla no longer really cares that much about the administration because they've already sold more than 200,000 cars. So they've expired their federal rebates. The companies that haven't include GM, Ford, and the others. So there's some attention on getting everyone else through that federal rebate for vehicles. And Tesla is largely seen to be on the right track. So I wouldn't really sweat those differences. I also saw Biden and one of the senators that I was working with in DC last week driving the electric Rivian, supporting the startup electric makers. So there's just support across the board for vehicle electrification because that's hugely important to American decarbonization. And I wouldn't sweat the Tesla problems. Probably doesn't help that Elon Musk asked if Bernie Sanders was still alive last week, which was the other side of the GM Tesla US politics coin. What is it like on the ground? So the Democrats just fought tooth and nail against themselves before even releasing the Build Back Better and the infrastructure plan. So Sinema and Manchin really gutted the climate ambitions of Biden. They successfully delayed it enough that Biden couldn't go to Glasgow with anything like, the initial stated ambition of the administration was 50% carbon reductions by 2030. The bill itself has now been whittled down to maybe achieving 5 or 10% emissions reductions. So the conservative middle, or the Republicans that are dressed as Democrats in the US, have hugely delayed Biden's climate agenda. That said, they've still got a huge number of things. There was, 100 billion for vehicle electrification and 40 odd billion for building electrification and retrofits. A huge amount of work going through the tax code. But I think very much like Australia, the real action in the US is at the state level, and it's individual state programs. So it's what the California Energy Commission is doing in this thing, and it's what NYSERDA, which is New York, is doing in this thing, that are the best of examples. And we're seeing, California's leading on mandating solar on new buildings, and on New York last week voted on no more gas in newly built homes. So you're seeing all of these sort of little examples happen in the States. On the ground, you see a huge number more electric vehicles in the US, particularly in California. There's like 10% of them now. So there's a Tesla every 3 or 4 homes, or some electric vehicle. But there's but in Sydney, you drive through suburbs where every second house has solar on the roof. In the US, it's still every 20th or 30th house. So I wouldn't be looking to the US as honestly a wonderful example. The good action, I honestly think, New South Wales, Victoria, ACT, with their various climate ambitions, they shouldn't be worried about what the US is doing. They should be looking in more detail at what California and Texas and New York and Maine and Vermont is doing. It has very interesting rooftop solar programs. So it's really in the details.
Craig and Gabrielle, maybe just before I hand back to Cassandra, we've got a federal election coming up. We've got a lot of great state policies. How dependent are we then on on federal policy going forward? We're going to have to sort of muddle through with state policies, because it just seems to be it's great, but they do to a certain extent it's haphazard. Craig, maybe first.
Look, I was going to say I'll defer to Gabrielle.
You do that.
I mean, it's really, Gabrielle's an expert, genuine expert. I have opinions, so I'll let you go.
Thanks, Craig. Giles, as you indicated, what we've seen is largely state governments picking up the slack on decarbonisation, and agree. We've seen great policies and commitments, not only out of New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT, but also some great work in Queensland with their CleanCo, and South Australia setting an ambition to be 500% renewables. And that's from a Liberal government. And obviously we have this very complicated Australian Federation. What I think would be the most important thing in terms of a change of federal government is that overall leadership and direction setting. And that's particularly important in terms of the cost of finance. So we've been having a number of discussions within IEFA recently about the fact that foreign financiers are looking at increasing the cost of debt for Australian governments. And obviously, as soon as that happens, then we've got a whole range of economic challenges. If we have a federal government that commits to serious decarbonisation, like we did have under the last federal Labor government, that will change the cost of capital. It will de-risk investment in Australia, and also obviously it will change the geopolitical landscape. And I would hope we'd retain some of the international standing that we've lost, particularly over the last few weeks with Glasgow, where frankly couldn't have been more embarrassing. Not only having a government that refused to commit to any sort of increased 2030 target, but then turned up at a pavilion in Glasgow sponsored by Santos and clearly was doing the bidding of the fossil fuel industry. So yes, the states can do a lot, and they are doing a lot, and their commitments and their investment are really important. It was state governments that built the coal-fired power stations in the first place, and in some ways we're going back to the future. But there is an absolutely vital role for the federal government, and I think that's also why you're seeing so much community support for the Climate 200, for the independent candidates who are standing on a climate change platform.
I think it's slightly more interesting and exciting than that. People might call it the greenwashing of Fox, but I actually think it is extremely internationally profound and important that Fox Murdoch in Australia sort of rescinded all of its prior climate denialism and now believes that it's going to be okay. And not only that, that it's going to save average Australians money. I think that the fact that that's now a headline in the Daily Telegraph and those that class of paper in Australia is hugely impactful. I believe Australia is a test market for that messaging being rolled out in the US before the 2024 election. I think it probably doesn't matter whether it's Labor or Liberal who wins the next election, because I don't think Australian government can hide the fact from the Australian people for much longer that this transition is going to be economically beneficial to the household. And so I think there's every chance that we're going to see the parties trying to compete on what looks like returning money to the average punter, because the right package of EV policy, solar, etc., is going to show hugely beneficial financial impacts to the electorate. So I think there's a sort of a proud white man problem. Everyone's got to try to figure out how to narratively get from their positions of the last 20 years to that future. But, we have a lot of politicians that are pretty good on turning on a dime on their narrative. So I think it could be a little more exciting, and I'm a little more optimistic.
I know we need to wrap, but I would say that's naive on two grounds. There's been lots of critique of News Limited's greenwash and how it's a front for continuing fossil fuel use. And also there's a massive difference between the parties. The National Party are controlling the Liberal Party's climate policy, and Barnaby Joyce said that he didn't sign up to Glasgow despite being the Deputy Prime Minister. So I think a change of federal government would make, especially if the balance of power is held by independents, would make an enormous distant difference, and that a lot of Liberal voters want to see that climate action, hence the fact that Liberal state governments like Matt Keane in New South Wales are acting.
Well, let's hope the independents get up then.
All right, we might have to wrap very soon, but it's been a wonderful, robust discussion, and also canvassed the many, many different ways that we can decarbonise and a whole diversity of views and thought leadership in this area. So thanks very much to our panellists. I do want to give Craig, I suppose, the last word in terms of the very last question for today. What is your wish on your wish list for the energy transformation, maybe from more industry lens rather than just a strict policy lens? What are your calls to action in this space? We've got a great audience with us. So Craig, I'll let you have the last word.
Oh, wow. Thanks. I'm not sure. No, look, I really, a great opportunity is to get a two-sided market. I mean, there's everything that's been said about policy and regulation and so forth. A lot of building blocks are there. We have a lot of advantages, as has been said, with the deregulation of the Australian electricity system, 25 years ago or so forth. The components are really there. It's a matter of harnessing some of those, and I think harnessing the innovation and trying to try not to fight the market, because the price signals are there. So if we can innovate to capture those, I'm very, very optimistic that we'll get there.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Craig, and thanks everyone. We really hope you enjoyed our webinar today together with Renew Economy. It's been recorded and it will be available on the Renew Economy website very soon, so you can share it with your friends. Plenty of food for thought and really exciting debate today on DER's role in the energy transformation. Thank you very much to our panelists and to our audience. Watch this space, get involved if you can, and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.